Some people argue that the concept of the Anglosphere, Commonwealth of Nations or CANZUK, is just a revival of British colonialism. But I see very few to nobody wanting to see a new imperial empire. The former British dominions can now stand on their own 2 feet and no longer need the UK's protection. But this doesn't change the fact that we would be stronger together. This argument is also quite ironic, as the same people are perfectly fine with the colonialism of Anglospheric nations by other populations. It seems to me perfectly reasonable to want to preserve your own people and culture. It is true that the majority of the people in favour of the Anglosphere want shared cultures, values and traditions to create a more harmonious nation, rather than a multicultural nation that history proves mostly ends in disaster. Surely then, the Anglosphere is the opposite to colonialism, as the nations of the Anglosphere believe in decentralisation and not forcing each other's ideas upon one another. This is the opposite to most other blocs that force everybody to adapt to the same culture. But what these people don't understand is that creating a multicultural nation is far from diverse, but instead just creates a strange hodgepodge. I'd argue that if you're in favour of true diversity, then you'd want Japanese culture and people in Japan, Indian culture and people in India, Mexican culture and people in Mexico, Tongan culture and people in the Tonga, and Anglosphere culture and people in the core Anglosphere nations. Therefore, the biggest thing that the Anglosphere needs to tackle is the idea of globalism. Do they just want their nations to become economic sector 12, with no real shared traditions, heritage or culture? Or do they want to retain what their ancestors built with sweat and blood? Will they be citizens of anywhere or a citizen of somewhere? Another colonial argument is that the core Anglosphere nations of Canada, New Zealand, Australia and the USA are built upon stolen land, and that the British people had no right to settle here. But they fail to understand or just choose to ignore the nuances of the past, and how differently, and I think we can all agree misguidedly, people fought back then. And by this same logic, no nation in the world would be a nation, as every nation is built on either migration or conquest, and often a mix of both. I think that those proposing a colonial argument have a sense of inferiority, have an anti-Western streak to them, or are just historically illiterate. But at the end of the day, it is not up to them, but up to the Anglospheric nations how they govern their nations. And although we shouldn't ignore their opinions and arguments, we should try to remember that they might not have our best interests at heart.
And one of the very peculiar features about England, which I think has become a kind of disease which has spread to the rest of the West, is the self-hatred of the English intellectual. I mean, it's written about very, very interestingly by George Orwell. You'll remember there's like just immediately before, well, on either side of the Second World War, in which there's that wonderful passage describing the kind of people who read The Guardian, you know, the sandal-wearing Quakerish classes, or invariably vegetarian or vegan, as the kind of people who would rather steal from the poor box than stand to sing the national anthem. And that, again, it goes back to the late 19th century. You've got in the Mikado's, in Coco's song in the Mikado, of all the people that he hated, it's those who sing the praises of every century but this and every country but their own. And this has become profoundly deep-rooted in Anglo-Saxon culture. It was, I think, essentially snobbery. I mean, English food's utterly disgusting. You know, you really, really must eat French. You know, the English have got absolutely, you give an example, absolutely no sense of style or dress. You know. Englishmen are just so ugly.
Please keep going, David,
you again.
This is the best moment of this episode. Please carry on.
You illustrate the point perfectly, and so on. And then, of course, it becomes given an extra crank and edge by race sensitivity, so it now shifts from snobbery to something else, which is that we, of course, as imperialists, are responsible for absolutely all the ills in the world, and then, of course, not only did we have an empire, we had slavery, as though every other culture in the world including China, did not have slavery. And in fact, the peculiar thing about the British Empire is that it may be built on slavery, but it then actually spends more money on eradicating than it ever made from it.
Sadly, you'll find the harshest critics and enemies of the Anglosphere is within itself, from its own people, who see themselves as having the moral high ground and who use emotional rhetoric instead of looking at things logically. This has been a long-running trend in English history, but I now see that it's spread across all of the core Anglospheric nations. Be sure to check out my other channel, History Sticks, for the complete, longer and comprehensive video.